Today we have with us Mr. Richard Mathews, Australia's Consul-General to Makassar. And in that role, he is responsible for the whole of Eastern Indonesia. Richard has had a very successful career, an extensive career, with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And this has included a number of postings around the world and a particular focus on Indonesia, and indeed he is a fluent Bahasa Indonesia speaker. He has spent time with the Northern Territory Government as Director of their Indonesia Centre. He has also been the Indonesia Merdeka Fellow at ANU, and he was Director of the Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies in Canberra. Today we'll be discussing the relationship between Australia and Eastern Indonesia, and what does this mean in the context of Australia's business opportunities, and particularly how we can build sustainable relationships with Eastern Indonesia, and how that in turn assists Eastern Indonesia to grow and develop in their quest to become a much more substantive economy in the years to come. Well, thank you for joining us here today, Richard.
Good morning, Leith. How are you?
Richard, as I briefly mentioned, you have been very familiar engaging with Indonesia prior to your current role as Consul-General in Makassar, not to mention being fluent in Bahasa Indonesia, an excellent skill to have. So can you tell us a little bit more about your background with Indonesia and how you developed an interest in the country?
Okay, well, it started a long time ago. I took what's now called a gap year and travelled around Asia a little bit. Didn't go to Indonesia, went to India and then to Europe. Then I came back to Melbourne University and wanted to study something about Asia. And there were about 5 languages offered: Bengali, Hindi, Chinese, Japanese, and Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, at Melbourne University back then. And I knew nothing about Indonesia. I travelled quite a lot, but I knew nothing about Indonesia. And Bahasa Indonesia sounded like a reasonably easy language to learn. So that was the decision that led to me getting involved with Indonesia. And it was a fantastic experience at Melbourne Uni because I had really good lecturers. And then eventually I became an Indonesian high school teacher in Victoria and in the Northern Territory. So that was back in the 1980s. And I've had a lot more to do with Indonesia since. I joined DFAT in 1991. I've had a few short-term missions to Indonesia. I've kept up my Indonesian ever since. Being married to an Indonesian has helped a lot in that. And my passion for Indonesia has been maintained throughout that period. And this posting to Makassar as Australia's first Consul-General is my first full-time posting to Indonesia. Despite the fact that I've been there several times for short-term missions and many times on holidays, this is my first full-time posting to Indonesia. And it's fantastic.
You're enjoying it there?
Yeah, it's a great job.
Oh, that's good.
It's, we feel like we're opening up a part of Indonesia which hitherto has not been sufficiently covered by our diplomatic presence in Indonesia.
We know that President Widodo has shown a lot of interest in Eastern Indonesia. In fact, it was part of his original platform in coming to power, and he has continued to visit Eastern Indonesia quite regularly since coming to power. What does that mean for Australia and our relationship with Eastern Indonesia?
Yeah, we do have responsibility to represent Australia across 11 provinces of Eastern Indonesia. Now, what is Eastern Indonesia has been an academic question in the past, but for us, the 11 provinces we cover are the 6 provinces of Sulawesi, the provinces of Maluku and North Maluku, East Nusa Tenggara, and Papua and West Papua. And our responsibilities are to promote Australian-Indonesian trade investment relationships, education, that's an extremely important part of our overall relationship with Indonesia, and people-to-people contacts. And we also have a consular function, that is to say helping Australians providing passports and so forth. But that's a very small part of our work in Makassar, because as yet there aren't too many Australians travelling or working in Eastern Indonesia. So our primary focus is effectively public diplomacy, trade and investment promotion. Now, Indonesia is growing at a reasonable pace. I think it's around about 5% per annum. Many of the provinces of Eastern Indonesia are growing at a faster rate, and most of that is due to infrastructure spending from the central government. The government's made a commitment to try and reduce the gap between rich and the poor, and infrastructure spending is an important part of that policy approach. So, for example, the government's building many new ports across Eastern Indonesia, or expanding existing ports, such as in Makassar and Bitung in North Sulawesi, Ambon and so forth. Now,
what size are those ports?
Most of them are relatively small, but Makassar is a big port. It's run by Pelindo 4, which is one of the government port management companies. It's at full capacity now, and it's a container port, and the new plan requires the government to build a new port on reclaimed land to the north of Makassar, and that plan will expand the container capacity 5-fold. So there's significant bit of investment going in. Other ports, like in Bitung, they're almost probably doubling their container capacity in the expansion they're planning. And even in smaller ports like Kendari, they're going to have a significant container management capacity. So the government's definitely committed to developing Eastern Indonesia through its infrastructure spending program, and hopefully private investment will follow that in due course.
And in your opinion, what sectors, if we can start to drill down a bit here now, what sectors should we really start to address in this relationship?
That's a question I'm often asked, for example, by governors and bupatis, that's regents and so forth. They often ask me, how can we contribute, for example, to the tourism sector? Every little island in Eastern Indonesia is ripe for, perfect as a tourism destination. The problems are getting there, infrastructure, transport and accommodation infrastructure, destination development, training and skills development. So if you take the tourism sector as an example, Australia can offer a lot in the training and upskilling of local people in Eastern Indonesia in hospitality and service industries. We have had a tourism industry for over 100 years or more. We have the experience, we have the capability to train and contribute to skills upgrading in that sector. So our hope is that through the negotiations under the Indonesia-Australia Closer Economic Partnership Agreement, we will be able to partner with Indonesian institutions, our institutions and Indonesian institutions, to contribute to sectors such as the hospitality sector. One initiative we started recently is an Australia Award short course in sustainable tourism for regional development, and that course will take place in Queensland beginning next Monday, and it'll be a 2-week course for professionals from the tourism sector across Eastern Indonesia. So from the tourism bureaus, the planning development boards, hotel managers, we've got tour guides. They'll all be coming to Australia, 30 of them, to participate in this course, and we hope that course will continue year after year, subject to funding, of course. But I think that will be a solid contribution from the Australian government, from the Australian industry, towards developing the planning skills and management skills required to develop a good tourism sector. And it will lead to better contacts between our tourism managers, investors and developers and the policymakers in the provinces of Eastern Indonesia.
Was that a competitive process for them to be?
Oh yes, we had 900 applicants. 900 people across Eastern Indonesia applied for this course, and we selected 30 through a competitive process. So we've got some really good participants. They're passionate, They're keen to develop their tourism sector, and hopefully we're going to provide them with useful tools to do so.
Now, for those working in this part of Indonesia, what are some of the aspects they should take into account in trying to become much more successful and sustainable and indeed profitable with their business going forward?
Unfortunately, over the past few decades, our expertise on Indonesia has declined significantly. Fewer people reportedly are studying Indonesian in our schools and universities than back in 1972. So I think we need to fix that problem, because Indonesia is growing. It's growing in ways we can't really predict, but it's growing. It'll have a population of over 300 million by 2032, which is not very far away. It'll be one of the 4th or 5th largest economies within 14 or 15 years. We need to have the skills to be able to deal with Indonesia effectively. So I would suggest to Australian companies, invest in training your staff, bringing your staff to a greater level of awareness through language studies, cultural studies, or some sort of corporate exposure to the Indonesian market, so that they're well trained and understand how to work with Indonesia. That's vital, I think, for our national future as well as for businesses individually.
What is the current investment in climate like?
It has its ups and downs. I think that's the best way to put it. There are some great opportunities in Indonesia. In the past, the mining sector's been a real challenge, but some of our miners have done very well in Eastern Indonesia. Now the regulatory environment is changing, and it's changing in a way which probably does not advantage existing miners. But if you're a new miner coming in and you study the market and learn what the regulations are, there are opportunities in various commodities: gold, silver, copper, nickel. There are opportunities. East Indonesia is a very rich mineral province, and not very much exploited compared to, say, the mineral provinces of South America. There's a lot more to be worked on in collaboration with Indonesia, and I think the best advice is get to know the regulations as well as you can. They're complex, but they're Indonesia's regulations.
So in the mining sector, is it still expected that it would include downstream processing?
That's a regulation that was introduced in the 2009 mining law. In January, that was relaxed somewhat, so there is now less pressure on, for example, nickel miners to export more highly processed ore. So that regulation has changed, but as I said, get to know the regulations. It's vital to know what the current requirements are from the Indonesian government.
Do you have some examples of existing success stories, or those that are in the making? With Australian companies operating?
In the mining sector, Newcrest.
Across the board?
Oh, across the board.
Well,
Okay.
let's start with you.
Well, mining, Newcrest is a good example. They've had a mine in Halmahera since the late 1990s, and that's been profitable for them and their partners, PT Antam. There's still interest from other companies in the mining sector. There's a Perth company. I think they'd be quite happy for me to say that Nusantara Resources from Perth are looking at a gold mine in South Sulawesi. There are other sectors where we've had some long-term relationships. For example, in Makassar there's a very large flour mill, which is 50% owned by CBH Holdings from Perth. And
they've been there a long time.
They've been there a long time, yeah. And the majority of the wheat used in producing that flour comes from Western Australia, or from Australia, and supplies almost all the white flour that's used in Eastern Indonesian provinces. And that's a relationship that should be fine for the foreseeable future. We supply the wheat, Indonesia processes it, turns it into flour or into noodles, and then exports it to other countries. So that's a success story. It's a quiet success story, but it's a success story.
In particular, the fact that it's embracing third country trade as well.
That's right, yeah. I think the the biggest success story, which we don't promote widely enough, is the contributions we've made to Indonesian education. We are still the most popular overseas destination for Indonesian students. Something close to 1/4 of all Indonesian students who choose to study overseas come to Australia. So we're providing high quality education at a competitive price, and we're close by. We're Indonesia's next door neighbour, and we can provide this quality education for them. But it's not just in selling our education services that we contribute. Our universities have for decades been working with Indonesian universities on research collaboration activities which have a fundamentally important impact on Indonesian development. And one example is a university in Darwin, Charles Darwin University. Academics from there have been working with regional governments in Southeast Sulawesi and in West Timor to research the impact of community mining activities on agricultural activities further downstream. And that information then provides evidence which is useful for the policymakers about how to manage water flow, how to manage community mining issues. So that's just one example of dozens of areas where our universities have been working with state universities or private universities across Eastern Indonesia, contributing with projects that directly benefit local communities and assist local governments. And that's a story that I think we need to tell more widely. I know the Australia-Indonesia Centre has been doing a lot of this sort of activity in energy, in agriculture and other sectors. And these stories I think we should be capitalising on to make sure people are aware across Indonesia of the benefits. Yeah, the benefits that flow from working with Australian universities. Not only do they benefit local communities, they benefit the Indonesian academics because they're able to participate in world quality research, get their names on the mastheads of international journals and further their careers.
What's the security situation across Eastern Indonesia?
From my perspective, it's safe and stable. There are pockets still of concern, such as in Central Sulawesi. We still have travel advisories advising Australians to reconsider their need to travel to Central Sulawesi and Papua, West Papua, because of security incidents that have happened there in the recent past. We're always reviewing those travel advisories. We're always reviewing them to try and make sure they reflect the current situation on the ground. But in Makassar, it's safe and stable. There are issues to do with crime, as in any big city, but there haven't been any radical Islamic activities that have been of concern to us in Makassar in recent years. So I would say it's as I said, safe and stable is the phrase I use, and everywhere I've been in Eastern Indonesia, I've been very welcomed and felt very safe, and we're very fortunate because Australia has a really good reputation across Eastern Indonesia because of historical reasons, and we've been a strong contributor through our aid program to Eastern Indonesian development.
Richard, what are the key challenges that Australian companies need to contemplate in their planning and development of their strategies in looking to do business?
One of the problems in Eastern Indonesia is lack of skilled and potential employees and low levels of English language. So you'll find that if you're, for example, I can talk perhaps about if you're a mining services company and you want to get involved in a project in Eastern Indonesia, it might pay to team up with a local institution or a local company purely for their ability to liaise between you and the local government. The other thing worth looking at for Australian companies is to draw on our alumni network. We have a huge alumni network across Indonesia and especially in Eastern Indonesia. scholars who did their masters and PhDs in Australia under the Australian Awards program. They are keen to retain their connections with Australia. They have very fond memories of the time they studied here, because for many of them it was a life-changing experience. And then they went back to their provinces, and now many of them are in relatively senior positions in local government, in business, in universities. They're a resource which we should draw on, our companies can draw on, and they're willing to help and to be involved, especially if it's a sector that they're an expert in. So I'd suggest companies do a bit of homework, and we're very happy at the Consulate-General in Makassar to help make those connections, because one of our key goals is to develop our alumni network. So we have an alumni group in Makassar of at least 300 to 400 people, and that's just the scholarship holders. You know, there's an even bigger group of self-funded alumni out there who we're trying to cultivate links with. Most of the self-funded alumni work in the private sector. We have another group of enthusiastic alumni forming a new group, a new association in Manado. And then there's active alumni groups in Ambon and in Kupang and in some of the other cities of Eastern Indonesia. So yes, think about the alumni and get in contact with them.
Now, Richard, among the top priorities for the Indonesian government in Eastern Indonesia, the two particular sectors are infrastructure and renewable energy. I'd welcome your thoughts on where Australia can contribute to the growth of those two sectors, especially in Eastern Indonesia.
The Consulate-General is working with the Australia-Indonesia Centre to develop a study tour for business experts, academics, on renewable energy to Makassar in March next year.
Which would then mean that power and energy could be off-grid.
That's right. There are a lot of similarities between the problems of Eastern Indonesia and the problems of outback Australia. You can't connect to a national grid if you're a little island, 20 minutes offshore Makassar. It's not economically feasible to run a cable. So the only alternative is to have your own on-island power supply, and a renewable energy battery with maybe diesel backup is the ideal solution. Now, how we can work together to bring about that sort of development is what I hope we'll cover in our renewable energy study tour. So there are lots of opportunities. There are thousands of islands and thousands of mountain villages which need power, and the government of Indonesia is committed to achieving 98% electrification rate. So,
Sure, that's high.
Yeah, there's opportunities there too.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for coming in today. We do appreciate you including this in your program whilst you're out here in Australia. And it's particularly important when we really do need to continue to raise awareness and change perceptions about doing business between Australia and Indonesia, and from your perspective, I guess, with your responsibilities, especially Eastern Indonesia.
Thank you very much.